Hello and welcome to a new series of Material Matters with Grant Gibson that launches in the build-up to the Material Matters Fair, running from the 18th to the 21st of September at Barge House, Oxo Tower Wharf. I know, it's not a very subtle reminder, but feel free to register now. I've done more than 100 shows now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Today, my guest is Oliver Heath. The designer, architect and author is one of the leading advocates for biophilic design. Along with his team and the sustainable platform Planted, he currently has an exhibition at the Roca Gallery in South London, which focuses firmly on biodesign, illustrating what it is, why it's important, and how it can be used in the spaces we inhabit. Since 1998, Oliver's also had a successful media career working for the likes of the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, the Discovery Channel and Norway's TV2. He's a regular on DIY SOS and was, of course, one of the designers on the iconic show Changing Rooms. He has quite a story to tell. Oliver, thank you very much for doing this. How are you?
I'm good, Grant. You missed out the most interesting bits that have got me more jobs than anything else, which was that I used to be a fire eater and a windsurfing instructor.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, do we talk about fire? I mean, how does one discover one can eat fire?
Carefully, initially.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
You're at a party and somebody says, have a go at this. How does that work?
I grew up in Brighton, which at that time was an interesting place to grow up. There was a real mix of artists and performers and entertainers and stuff like that. And we had a family friend who was a female clown, and she lent me her unicycle, and I learned that when I was about 10. And then my mother sort of found this fire eating course and thought that would be a good idea for me to do that as a sort of career progression. To be honest, it was all really good until I was fire eating at a college ball in Oxford where I was studying, and blew into the wind in a courtyard in one of the quads, and it blew back and set my head on fire. So I had my moment of being on fire on stage, which was, I thought everyone was shouting at me, Oliver, that's amazing. Yeah. But it turned out they were shouting, Oliver, your head's on fire. But nobody actually stopped me and put me out.
Oh my God. So did this mean casualty and lots of hospital and skin grafts and things like that?
I actually had more hair than I do now. It just took a little bit off the side, really quite neat. Yeah.
Okay. It would be good to know, now we've got through the fire eating stage of your career, but it'd be good to know where you are, because I'm looking at you across a camera because we're using a kind of virtual studio. You have a lot of foliage behind you, but it's not giving away where you might be.
Yeah, I'm actually speaking to you from my home in Brighton, and I live kind of right in the middle of town, quite near town. So it's not an enormous house, but we've got a nice garden and, plants, greenery, a little bit of black stained timber in the back there. It all goes to kind of create the ideas of biophilic design that I'm experimenting with in my own home.
Yes, so you're walking the walk as well as talking the talk.
Exactly, yeah.
So I'm going to cheat a little bit, because we do a thing traditionally on the show where I talk about how the person I'm speaking to studio looks like and how they work. So you're not there, but let's pretend perhaps that you are. What does your studio look like? Is it a tidy workplace?
I would say it's a creative space. I like to have things around me and near me. I like things sort of that I can touch and feel and smell. I'm quite a sensory person. So having materials, textures, patterns, I guess, information around me. So it's not untidy. It's sort of ordered, but it's not sort of pristine and minimal. I find those sorts of spaces quite anxiety inducing. So it's nice to have a little bit of background noise going on. It could be seagulls drifting through the window, the noise of the seagulls, or it could be the radio on the background. But there's lots of materials, there's lots of plants and greenery. We've got rise and fall desks, ergonomic chairs, and a sort of big table that we all tend to gather around and have soup at lunchtime. So it's quite a social office. It's quite a sensory office, and certainly one to inspire each and everybody that works in it.
Yes, the soup thing is in your book. We'll come on to talk about later, but I'm quite intrigued by the power of soup. Soup looms large in your life at lunchtime, seemingly. It's your foodstuff of choice.
We use it as a sort of an opportunity to stop people from working at their desks. So basically it's a sort of a democratic system of everybody choosing what we're going to eat for lunch. Somebody goes off to the shops. We've got a soup maker. We chuck all the ingredients into this sort of cylindrical soup maker. And then, sort of 1 o'clock, we'll gather around the table and eat hot soup. So not only does it stop people working at their desks, it's a kind of therapeutic moment for us all to gather. The studio is filled with quite different age people, with me being at the sort of upper end of it. And so it's a really great opportunity for people to sit around the table, have a conversation, talk about the things they're seeing, doing, watching, reading, asking questions of one another, touching in, checking we're all okay. But also, I think, to eat healthily and eat in a way that considers our microbiome, which in a sense is the root of our connection to nature. So our microbiome is the kind of, or all those kind of organisms that live in our stomach that help us digest food.
Gut health is where we're going here.
Yeah, your gut health, exactly. And I think it has a sort of quite a profound effect on our physical and mental well-being in ways that we have yet to fully discover. So looking after our gut microbiome is kind of fundamental to the well-being of the people in the office. And it's kind of where our connection to nature, I think, should really start.
Let's talk a bit about your practice. How big is your practice? How many people are you?
We're not a big practice. There's about 6 of us at the moment. We're a combination of researchers, psychologists, writers, designers, and people sort of very practically minded people who put all these things together. So our work is very collaborative. So when we talk about the projects that we've done, like at the Roca Gallery, this is very much a kind of joint exercise between the writers, researchers, strategists, who are Victoria Jackson and Rosa Isaacs, and then members of the rest of the team who are kind of helping to put these things together. I think that's actually quite often forgotten, that, we do have these kind of eponymously named practices. And I think all too often, it's just the sort of the kind of the one person at the head of the practice who tends to kind of get brought forward. But it's important for us to try and promote the kind of other members of the team and their contributions.
And what kind of work do you take on as a practice? I mean, you sounds like you have a variety of people working away in the background. So what kind of projects do you do?
Yeah, our work kind of falls into 3 key areas. It's sort of writing, strategy, and consultancy. So we work with practices and organizations like Accor, John Lewis, Bloomberg as biophilic design consultants, advising them on nature connections. We work as designers, actually pulling these ideas and turning them into 3-dimensional spaces. Those are largely sort of architectural interiors. And then I spend a lot of my time talking, hosting seminars, workshops, maybe working with the group Planted to host talks and events.
You seem pretty busy at the moment. Amongst other things, you published a book fairly recently called Designing a Healthy Home. I think that was 2 years ago. The practice seems to regularly publish what are called white papers nowadays. I mean, it's not a parliamentary thing, but they kind of reports. The latest one is on life-centered design. And then there's the exhibition that we've alluded to already called Biospaces at the Roca Gallery, West London. In some ways, they're all centered around or certainly include biophilic design, the notion of which has been with us for some time, I guess. I mean, Erich Fromm, the socialist psychoanalyst, first described it in his 1973 book, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. He described it as, and I like this, the passionate love of life and all that is alive. But how would you define it?
We describe biophilia as the sort of human innate connection to nature and natural processes. And it sort of explains in a very simple sort of level why when we go on holiday to reduce stress levels and to recuperate and become ourselves again, we tend to head to areas where we can immerse ourselves in nature, be that the beach, the forests, or the mountains. And so essentially it's an evolutionary design ethos that recognizes that as human beings, we've existed in very close connection to nature for our basic human survival. So for hundreds of thousands of years, we've wandered through natural environments looking for landscapes that could support human life, landscapes that might have water, fruit, nuts, wood for building or for burning, stone for building, stone for weapons, spaces where we can shelter and look out over kind of landscapes and see potential opportunities and potential threats. And since that point, of course, we've become very urbanized, and yet we have what we call a genetic inheritance, which means that we still have this connection to nature, and we still find it very calming, relaxing, and restorative. And yet when we live in busy, noisy, stressful, urban, geometric environments, we find these spaces devoid of nature. And whilst we're very adaptable and we can theoretically survive, it doesn't mean that we're living life at its best. And when we talk about living life at its best, it means that many of the buildings that we're designing don't truly deliver on their intended function. And so there are sort of lots of negative costs around absenteeism, presenteeism, but we're not also reaching the true potential. So biophilic design is really a set of ideas and principles that allows us to bring nature into buildings to help us manage stress, to recuperate, but also to form deeper connections to that space and the people in it.
So how do you do that? Are there core principles when you're taking on a project?
Yeah. At its very center, there are three core principles to biophilic design. So the first is a direct connection to nature. So this is how we bring real sensory forms of nature into the built environment. So it might be about natural light, fresh air, water, the gentle movement that we see in nature. It is, of course, as well about bringing fauna and flora into those spaces as well, if that works. The second one is what we call an indirect connection to nature. It's how we mimic or evoke a feeling of nature through natural materials, colors, textures, patterns, and interestingly now, technology. And the third one is the human spatial response. So it's how we create spaces that make us, give us the opportunity to relax, restore, and recuperate ourselves, these ideas of prospect and retreat. But also, how do we create spaces that are exciting, stimulating, and creative? And so biophilic design is really how we use these three core ideas and use the patterns within them, as we call them, and pick on those patterns to deliver the intended function and minimize some of those kind of negative aspects of a space.
Okay, interesting. I mean, can we talk a little bit about the history behind it? Because if Fromm was an early adopter, there are others who have progressed that thinking since over the years.
Yeah, so we have the likes of Edward O. Wilson. He worked together with Fromm and they developed the idea of biophilia, that idea that, as human beings, we're essentially cave people with Instagram, and sort of recognize that now, it's nice that, recognize that, now that we live in cities, we still desire to be in and around nature. But it was really sort of the likes of Stephen Kellett who picked up this idea and transferred them into a series of built environment features, or what we tend to call patterns. So he had a very sort of creative list of over 70 different features or patterns that was then reduced down to about 26. And that was then revised again by the American group Terrapin Bright Green, who reduced it down to 14 and have now kind of bumped it up to 15. So there are varying degrees of complexity of how you want to approach it.
I suspect, and maybe I'm wrong, but I suspect that some companies had realized the potential for nature for their workers sometime before the likes of Wilson and Keller. I mean, during the 50s and 60s, US companies like AT&T, Bell and John Deere created campus-style offices and bucolic settings in the US. ICI did something similar in Cheshire. I mean, I guess it was a blunt way of doing it, but it was an effort to bring nature into the workplace.
Yes. When we say that Eric Fromm and Edward O. Wilson discovered it, it was always there. We all knew that we liked being in and around nature. And this is, in a way, it's kind of what we call a universal design ethos. Everybody has particular design styles they might gravitate towards or feel a relationship with. But some are quite polarizing. But the idea that you might be designing with nature is something that everybody can kind of get behind. So in an era where we have an enormous access to different design styles and examples of design of what we think is good, that sort of nature-based approach is one that actually seems to have universal appeal. And I think that's really interesting when we're starting to think about the different personality types and the diversity of people in spaces, of how do we design a space that is going to suit everyone? Well, actually, if we think about those colors, materials, textures, the natural shapes and forms of leaves and greenery, that simple idea that we might like to enjoy looking out over a green space from a point of safety. These are all things that everybody enjoys. And when I give talks and seminars to people, and I ask them, to think of a space where they feel most happy, calm, and relaxed, it's amazing how many people actually put their hands up when I say, is the space you're thinking of right now a space filled with a body of water, trees and greenery in the distance, open grasslands, maybe blue skies and little kind of fluffy clouds. And everybody's kind of surprised when they look around to see that everybody's got their hand up, and this is sort of similar picture that they have in their mind's eye.
Which is interesting because nature isn't straightforward, is it? I mean, nature can be frightening, intimidating, and out of scale, and deadly and brutal.
Absolutely. Yeah. So biophobia is absolutely a real thing. And it's really interesting how strong that is. There were studies where scientists, environmental psychologists put together two images. One was of a spider and one was of a gun. And when people saw the image of the spider, they recoiled back because they were scared of it. And yet it's probably the gun that kills more people than spiders. So it's interesting that we have learned to be afraid of the movement of snakes and spiders and maybe vermin. And yet when we see an image of a gun, we don't have the same effect to it. So it is really interesting how deep some of these ideas are ingrained within all of us.
So don't bring spiders into your interior design. Seems to be the moral of this particular story.
Yes. I mean, you have to be conscious that certain people do have a fear of certain types of nature, certain types of plants, of course, poisonous. You have to be conscious of that and considerate to how you bring nature in. But part of the process of deciding how you create essentially more human-centered spaces using the likes of biophilic design is by undertaking pre and post occupancy evaluations, trying to understand what are the preferences that people have and how can we bring those into the space to elicit a positive emotional response to that space.
Yeah. Should we talk about the show to begin with, which I think has quite a lot in common with what we're doing at Material Matters? I mean, you, as you said, co-curated it with your colleagues, Victoria Jackson, Rosa Isaacs, along with my friend Deborah Spencer at Planted. You describe it in the opening text as a call to action to stop designing nature out and start to usher it back into our spaces, pointing out that we're in the midst of a triple crisis of climate, of biodiversity, as well as social and economic. So how do you illustrate this across the show? There are 6, well, you describe them as islands, but 6 topics that you cover.
Yes. I mean, we're conscious that when we talk about sustainable buildings, there is a very loud conversation around carbon accounting, the embedded and operational carbon. And that seems to be like, if you get the carbon right, then it's job done. So it tends to forget the role that nature plays and all the other issues that can have a positive contribution to our fight against this triple crisis. So the exhibition is essentially laid out into a series of 6 islands that explore different bio-based approaches to design. Each one is really a brief snapshot for what a lot of organizations and people, for them, it is, a lifetime's work. So we cover subjects such as biophilic design, bio-based materials. We've got designing for biodiversity, biomorphic design, biomimetic design, and bioregenerative design. So each of the 6 islands essentially explores, what is the subject? Why is it so important right now? And how are we going to bring it into the built environment? And then we illustrate it through a series of examples of different scales. So that might be from a building that has embraced those ideas, a piece of furniture, a product, or also potentially a material.
Very good. Can we jargon bust a little bit here?
Yeah.
Because you've already described biophilic design. I mean, we do plenty on the podcast on bio-based design, as well as the fair, and likewise biodiversity. The last 3, biomorphic, biomimetic, and bioregenerative. What are they?
So biomorphic design essentially is how we mimic the shapes and forms and patterns that we find in nature. As human beings, we evolved in close connection to nature, so that when we see those shapes, those patterns, it sort of has a sense of familiarity to us that is quite restorative. And actually, evidence shows that when people see statistical fractals, which are the sort of shapes, the repetitive forms that we find in the likes of trees, it can actually help to reduce stress by up to 60%. So it can have quite a significant effect. So when we talk about biomorphic design, it might be about mimicking the shapes that we see in trees in terms of the branches and how they split, and that shape is then repeated into the form of a leaf. It might be about, the shapes of flowers or the organic forms that we find. So that is, if we think about buildings by the likes of Victor Horta and Anthony Gaudi, those are very biomorphic buildings. When we talk about biomimetic design, this is really looking at nature's engineering systems and looking at how it solved enormously complex problems in a way that doesn't require heat and energy to be used in the same way that we do now. So biomimetic design looks at how nature solved these problems and helps us by using these examples to solve the complex issues that we might be facing today. So good examples of this are how the bullet train in Japan has mimicked the shape of a kingfisher's beak to reduce the kind of the air pressure as it goes through tunnels. It might be about copying the fin of a whale in the shape of a wind turbine, but it might also be bigger and thinking about the sort of the systems that operate in a building, the resources, how they're used, how they're minimized and used more efficiently, and how the building in a way becomes more similar to the natural systems that we find all around us. And then moving on to bioregenerative, this is really looking at how we can pull together all of these sort of other approaches and think about the systems that we're living in and help us to reconsider that as human beings, we are not separate or master of nature itself, but actually very much part of it, and reposition ourselves within this sort of interconnected web of environmental responsibility and connections. So bioregenerative essentially looks at how we move from being just about sustainable, clinging on to doing less bad, and moving into a position where our buildings can positively contribute to the state of the environment to help to restore it.
So do you think the industry is guilty of concentrating too heavily on carbon emissions in that case?
It seems to be a sort of relatively sort of common practice that the carbon accountancy aspect is the way that we measure the success of a sustainable building. But there are clearly so many other routes to consider and aspects that we should be interweaving into that process. So the sort of 6 bio-based approaches, I think, can all be brought together. And I think I would stress that whilst, we tend to focus on biophilic design, the likes of Michael Paulin might focus on biomimicry. Maybe Zaha Hadid is more on the biomorphic design. I think it would be there's an opportunity there for us as designers to borrow aspects of each, to break down these professional silos and actually start to kind of look at how we might interweave these ideas to create buildings that are not just kind of reducing their impact, measuring the carbon, trying to be sort of net positive, and actually move into a space where the building isn't just about reducing its impact, but actually positively contributing to it in a number of different ways. So the work of the likes of Ken Yang is really interesting. So he is both an engineer, an architect, and studied in sort of environmental studies as well. And so when he creates these buildings, he's thinking about the way flora and fauna interact with the exterior of the building and thinking about that in a sort of different stratospheric level. And how animals at the ground level might start to use and integrate with some of the flora on the building, but also think about how other insects and pollinators might interact with it at higher levels.
So not just a green wall, in other words, that nobody waters and then goes a bit brown.
Yeah, I think going far beyond that and thinking about the sort of habitats that are actually being creative that might support the local flora and fauna.
I mean, in a review of the show in the RABA journal, the writer Pamela Buxton says that you believe, and I'm going to quote, there's a real deficit in the understanding of nature-based design in architectural education. So where are architecture schools going wrong, in your view?
Certainly when I studied, there was a lack of interest in the sort of psychology around architecture. We were lucky when I was studying at Oxford Brookes that there was a head of psychology, but it was rather sidelined as well. And then when I moved into the Bartlett, there was sort of scant idea that we might be looking at environmental psychology or psychology itself to help us define how we create better buildings that suit the needs of the occupants. And then, of course, even less sort of connection to how those buildings might support not just human life, but all life going on around the building. If you think about the idea that, in a handful of soil, there's more life than all the population of the entire globe in one handful of soil, then actually it starts to help you consider that when we create buildings and we dig up all that earth and we build our foundations and we start to build upwards, we're impacting on enormous numbers of other living things that should really have and find a home within this sort of edifice that we're creating. So I think there is an opportunity to take a more environmentally all-life approach to the built environment in education to help us understand that, without nature, we can't survive. It's not as if we can just kind of put it to one side. We can't do without the bees, the insects, the flora that provide so much of our built environment and the systems that we're absolutely totally dependent on. So we do need to take this bigger picture that it's never just about the building. It's about the impact that building has on all living things.
Which is really what your latest white paper is all about, life-centered design.
Exactly. Yes. So we wrote this with the flooring company Interface, who have been an enormous supporter for us over the last 15 years. And they've really allowed us to explore a number of different topics around biophilic design, but also then move forward into thinking, well, what else? One of the limitations of biophilic design essentially is that it's a human-centered response. It looks at the benefits that nature provides to people in buildings in terms of, let's say, reducing stress, aiding recuperation, helping people get back to being at their best, improving the functionality of buildings, minimizing costs. But actually, now we're going to have to go a little bit further. It's not enough just to think it's a sort of singular beneficial approach. We've got to look at the mutualistic benefits. If biophilia truly is about the love of all life, then surely we should be not just seeking to be rewarded through connecting to it in our own way, but also looking at how we can help it to survive, thrive, and flourish.
Which is part of something that we've talked about on this podcast before. I mean, there's a river in New Zealand which has been given human rights.
The Ranganui River, I think is...
Exactly right, yeah. Eric Chen over at the New Institute in Rotterdam has been involved in turning it into a zoop, so giving microbes a voice on the board, as it were. And this is architecture's response to a movement, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. Yes, it's a sort of recognition that all life is affected by the creation of buildings. When we were writing the white paper, really what we're trying to do with that initial paper was to explore the subject, to say that all life has a right to survive and we should be doing our best to help it thrive and flourish because we're so dependent on it. The reality is that it's difficult to identify a building that fully embraces all those principles that are embedded within it. So we're at the early stages. And I think in terms of this sort of regenerative approach, we are having to ask ourselves ever deeper questions that we don't necessarily have the answers to just yet. And particularly in the built environment where systems are so set, where the success of a building might be measured in a building program, in a budget, or possibly, a carbon calculation. Where's the room to consider the impact on all life and how a building has impacted on it? So, we're at the early days of how we actually start to think about this, and where regenerative design or life-centered design, and there are similarities between those two really, exists more prolifically is really in the world of product design, where products can be created, tested, and improved in a much faster way. So it's starting from there. The seed is being sown, and we're slowly starting to see materials, products, and smaller pieces of architecture start to think about how life can be supported in generally by what we create.
Hope you're enjoying the show so far. This is just to remind you that the Material Matters Fair runs from the 18th to the 21st of September at Barge House, Oxo Tower Wharf. There is going to be loads to see, including an installation on the future of textiles from Biotech's Future. Studio Sane Vissa will be creating a hairdressers where visitors can have a free haircut and then watch the waste hair being spun and turned into rope. Studio Tit will be using construction waste to transform our entrance. Transport expert Prisma Good is our design studio of the year. Hydro will be doing amazing things with scrap aluminium. A collaboration between architect and designer TP Bennett and the furniture practice. looks at how materials are affecting the contract design world with brands including Mark & Bisley, Modus, ARPA, Norman Copenhagen, Chimera and SAS International, Fredericia and many, many more. And there'll be designers and makers working in everything from roots and mud to mycelium and orange peel. Oh, and there are talks too from the likes of Mark Mirdovnik and Caroline Till and Jonathan Smales off the podcast and loads of others in a space created with our official acoustic partner, Woven Image. It's all very exciting. The event is free for trade, but you must, and I repeat, must register in advance. The link is in the show notes. I'm keen to return to the show for a moment because I was interested in a piece of text on the wall as part of the exhibition that said that natural doesn't directly translate to sustainable or regenerative. Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, a great example is asbestos, which is essentially a natural material, but it doesn't mean it's terribly good for us, as we well know. So it was, used as a fire retardant material for many years before it was discovered to be carcinogenic. So I think that's a great example of how natural doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have a positive contribution to our own built environment.
And we do quite a bit on clay on this podcast. I have a healthy love of pots. Is clay a biomaterial? Should we be using it? You seem to suggest not in the show.
Well, I guess it's up for discussion. The way we've approached it is that because it is so slow to regenerate, it shouldn't really necessarily be considered as a bio-based material in use in the built environment because of the amount of time it simply takes for it to be kind of reformed. So in that respect, we're very careful with the way that we suggest it's being used because, of course, once we dig it up and it's taken out of the ground, whilst it may be a material that can follow circular economy principles and sort of be taken back into the earth, once it's used, it isn't necessarily going to regenerate itself. So, yeah, there are pros and cons where it should be used.
The other interesting thing about your recent output has been your desire to bring biophilic thinking into the home, because I guess predominantly before that, it's been the province of workplaces where productivity can be measured. The fascinating thing about your book, it seems to me, is that much of it is about common sense or common design sense, really. It's the kind of thing you might have heard from a feng shui expert 25 years ago. But the difference is there's an awful lot of statistics in your book. It's vital that these claims are substantiated in some way. So you can point to the effect that wood has on our heartbeat, for example. Evidence, it's really important to what you do.
Yeah, we do take an evidence-based approach because I think traditionally design has been at the hands of, the superstar designers. So, when I was studying architecture, we might be looking at Mies van der Rohe, Luz, or Corbusier, and they were hailed as design heroes. And you could criticize them, but they were generally recognized as being leaders in their field. But actually, there was never any evidence to suggest they were better buildings. There was never any sort of research that suggests that if you work in a Corbusian villa, you might be happier, healthier, more productive. And if we start to take that approach of, well, maybe we do demand evidence and maybe, our clients do as well, it becomes very important. So when I left architecture school and started to discover the work of Edward O. Wilson and Stephen Keller and look at some of the evidence that supported the biophilic design approach, I was fascinated by this evidence and how it's been demonstrated in workplaces to improve productivity by between 6 and 15%, improve well-being by 15%, in education to improve the rates of learning and improve test scores in hospitals, how it has the ability to improve rates of recuperation by 8.5% and reduce the need for medication by 22%. There are so many statistics that demonstrate the value of this nature connection. I think it just makes it that much more compelling, particularly if we've got a new design style that is slowly being tested out. To have these numbers just demonstrates its value and I think potential return on investment for the people like our clients who are wanting more from what design traditionally has offered them.
Yeah, sure. And can we talk about wood and the heartbeat? Because that's quite an interesting thing. The material having a direct effect on your physiology.
It's really interesting. There are several studies from around the world that have demonstrated from Scandinavian countries right through to Japan and Australia how the introduction of timber has the ability to reduce heart rates and blood pressure. So studies have shown in schools how the introduction of timber walls in classrooms can reduce heart rates by 8,600 beats per day. How people who've slept in a particular type of pine bed have a reduced heart rate of 2,600 beats per day, or perhaps I should say per night. So this idea that we're introducing a natural material is really interesting. And I think particularly for designers who work in urban settings, the idea that we might be able to choose materials that improves our physiological and psychological response to a space is really interesting. So it's not just about the quality of the space and what it looks like, but the fact that it can sort of soothe the senses. Maybe that's improving the humidity. Maybe it's improving the olfactory quality of the space, maybe the acoustics. Maybe it is about the statistical fractals and the patterns that we're seeing in the grain of timber that is familiar and yet, and as a result, relatively calming and restorative. It's really fascinating. And I think when people walk into spaces with timber on walls, particularly if used in quite a careful approach, the introduction of that material does immediately affect that. I've used timber in a number of ways in my own home, whether it's reclaimed timber from larch that came down in Kew Gardens, or whether it's the sort of timber wall that you can see behind. I find it a really relaxing and restorative materials that adds a natural sense to the space, but also has this sort of quiet, calming quality to it.
But it's timber that's treated in a certain way, isn't it? Seeing the grain is quite important in your view.
I think so, yeah. So, I mean, if we sort of look at the kind of shosugi band type materials that have sort of we've kind of seen in Japan, brush materials that sort of rather enhance the grain, maybe the use of stains to actually kind of bring that grain out is important. I think one thing to note is that with artificial materials becoming so good at mimicking natural materials, it's quite difficult sometimes to tell the difference between a plastic and a real timber. So I think the more you can bring out the natural quality of the timber through the surface finish, through the physical texture of it, the more that it feels natural and there isn't a replication of pattern, the better, really. So, I think also, when we touch materials, we can very, very quickly sense whether a material is real or artificial. So I think the body's senses can be fooled if we're just looking at something from a distance. So it's important for us as designers to go a little bit further and try and accentuate the kind of the key individual unique aspects of that.
Can we talk about your background a little bit, Oliver? Am I right in thinking your family were psychotherapists?
Yes, still are. Yes, there's lots of psychotherapists in my family, yeah.
That's interesting. How many?
My sister's training to be a psychotherapist at the moment, my mother, my stepfather. Enough of them to influence a sort of train of thought, so to kind of want to ask more.
Yeah, but you weren't tempted into the family tradition.
I always knew I wanted to study architecture, actually. So I think there was an opportunity there to take that architectural approach and think about it from a psychological perspective. And biophilic design allowed me to step into that area.
When did you decide you wanted to be an architect? But I mean, literally always.
I think from about the age of 10 or 11. Yeah, we had a family friend who had created a circular house, and I just thought it was just the most fascinating things that the house might be circular, and from that circular space were offshoots of different rooms that people could go into, and it was just a sort of really intriguing concept that walls and buildings didn't need to be defined by straight lines and geometric shapes and forms. And so it was just something that sort of made me stop in my tracks. The other thing is, growing up in Brighton, we had some rather fantastical buildings, being the likes of the Brighton Pavilion and the Brighton Piers, which formed very early memories of a connection to nature. So one of my earliest memories was walking along the pier in Brighton and looking down and seeing the waves rolling underneath and feeling the spray on my face, seeing the seagulls and the kind of the amazing sort of joyous forms that were incorporated into the shapes of the pavilions on those piers. And the idea that architecture could bring joy, delight, and nature connection obviously was something that was set quite deep into my mind.
What were you like at school?
At school, I think I was quite average, actually. until I discovered architecture and went to study architecture, I don't think I'd really found my true calling. So at the point that I went to study architecture and then went on to study the postgraduate at the Bartlett, this was something I just really enjoyed. I loved it. The idea that space could influence the way you feel, could convey information, could help support an intended function was just fascinating to me. That just how powerful the creation of space was through light and form, texture, material, and I think importantly also the senses.
But then after you graduated from the Bartlett, I think I'm right in saying you went into kind of set and exhibition design. So why did you decide to do that?
I went sort of largely into exhibition design, working on the likes of the Millennium Dome and the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, partly because I was really interested in the senses and how we could convey messages through design and architecture through the senses in a variety of different ways. So whether that was through shape and form, whether it was through graphic interpretation of media, whether it was through film. So when I was designing galleries for the National Maritime Museum, I was not only designing the shapes and the forms of them, I was also writing the content and curating the objects that we were seeing, but also managed to sort of siphon off the creation of the films to support the galleries as well.
Oh, get you, blimey.
My brother's a musician as well, so he was writing the scores for the films. I was shooting them and directing them. And so it was a sort of fantastic multimedia world that I was creating, and that was kind of a real honor.
I mean, subsequent to that was this TV career, and most famously Changing Rooms, that ran on the BBC from 1996 to 2004. For those of you who are listening who are too young to remember, the idea was that friends or neighbours swapped houses and decorated a room for one another with the help of a professional designer. You're rubbing your face like you don't want to talk about this.
Go ahead. You started, so I'm going to let you finish, Grant.
I'm going to make you. It was revived for Channel 4 in 2001. I mean, it was an iconic programme and was, in my view, partly responsible for changing the way the British thought about contemporary design. I mean, around that time, I think 1995, 100% Design launched, Wallpaper magazine started, and that tapped into a different market. But between them, they kind of changed the nation. I mean, before that, you had somebody like the controversial politician Alan Clark, who described Michael Heseltine as the type of man who bought his own furniture, which was meant as an insult. Sometime in the 90s, the UK began to learn to understand contemporary design. Looking back, and you're rubbing your face, so maybe listeners can't see that though. Looking back, how do you feel about it now?
So at the time, it was sort of a strange time. Like I said, I was sort of working on film sets, directing films. I was living in a warehouse in Brick Lane, kind of illegally, so I was sort of salvaging materials for this sort of warehouse. We actually won second prize in the RIBA Small Projects competition for the design of the warehouse that we'd done. And so it was a sort of real contrast to step into the world of television design. And essentially what happened was I entered the warehouse design into a competition on BBC Two. From that, we won the competition. I started working on a program called Homefront on BBC Two. I then got approached by Changing Rooms to say, would you be interested in being a designer? And I have to say, when they phoned me up, I was like, can I think about this? And they were like, no, you don't understand. We're asking you to be on the biggest design program on television. I'm like, yeah, I know. I'm going to think about that. I'll call you back. Anyway, I thought it was a great opportunity to step into, that very accessible world of design and talk about things that were a little bit more important. So rather than just look at design as being an opportunity to talk about aesthetic style, look at it as a consideration that actually design was an enormously powerful medium that could shape lives, could help us to live better, healthier, happier ways. And although some of those ideas had yet to be fully formed, I was really keen to use it as a platform to talk about sustainability, recycling, creating healthy environments, reducing toxins, upcycling, reuse, and to start to talk about how design could be used as a force for good. Now, I know those are very sort of high, lofty ideas for the likes of Changing Rooms, but we did start to get some of those ideas in. An awful lot did end up on the cutting room floor. And I was prepared to kind of weather that in order to get some of those messages out there. But if somebody would, stop me in the street and say, I love the way that you kind of think about reusing or recycling materials, and I knew I had a little win. If we would talk about, low energy lighting or, color changing lighting, then that was a win. And actually, as this kind of conversation went on, I got these opportunities to talk about things that I felt were important that weren't being addressed on mainstream TV. So when I was working on DIY SOS, we did do a biophilic designed home, and the message was kind of introduced to the British public in a very small way. But, I did have somebody, a scaffolder hanging off a scaffolding rig, shout to me across the street going, "Oi, mate, I love that biophilic design stuff." And I'm like, yes, okay. If you just get the occasional win like that, then it's kind of all worth it.
No, I love that.
Yeah. So it was really looking at that, the bigger picture, and saying, why is nobody talking about the things that are really important that we should be addressing through design? And that's what I wanted to try and set out to do.
So did you see yourself as a kind of antidote to the flamboyant Lawrence Llewellyn-Bowen, who's kind of the one that people always think about when they think of that show?
Yeah, I do. And I think that was quite a healthy thing, for Lawrence to be doing all the kind of flouncy, flourishing stuff that he did. That was his, but it was also a canvas for me to say, yeah, you can do that. But equally, you could be recycling these bits of furniture, reusing them, using your creativity, creating homes that reflect a little bit more about who you are and the environment outside and how you might connect with that. So, yeah, there was kind of room for all of that to happen. So that allowed me to kind of find my niche.
I mean, I guess your career could have taken a very different path had you wanted. You were never tempted to go and do I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here like a couple of your colleagues on that show did.
I think, God, that would be fun though, wouldn't it?
I couldn't do the eating stuff.
No. And now being a vegetarian, I don't quite know what they'll do with me.
Yes,
really.
That'd be
it's like, what, you're going to eat like a beetroot? Wow, it's I don't know. So I don't know. I know that politicians go on there and say, I'm doing this because I want people to understand more about this or that or my approach, but I never really saw it as a great opportunity. It never kind of went down there. I mean, I've got to say, actually, when I was doing the likes of changing rooms, social media had yet to be invented.
Oh no, it's a remarkable thought.
I know, that just makes you realize how old we are, huh? I mean, literally, Facebook had not been invented. So none of that stuff was really happening. The cult of celebrity wasn't really as fully formed as it is today. So I saw myself as having an opportunity to go into that world with an architectural education to talk about things that I felt were a little bit more important than this year's must-have colour.
There is a degree of snobbery in the design world. Was it easy to come off a show like that where you had been extraordinarily accessible, I guess, and reinvent yourself professionally?
There is a lot of snobbery. Yeah. I don't think it's been that easy, because it still comes up even, 15, 20 years later.
I'm sorry. That's my fault.
That is your fault.
You're blaming me.
I know, you're bringing it up again. I thought I was over it. It's okay. I mean, I think you just have to embrace it. When you're self-employed, you have to take the opportunities that come towards you. You have to measure those and say, are they in line with my values, my ethos of what I really want to be doing? So we do turn work down from organizations when they come to us if we don't really believe that what we're doing now is aligned with them. So, if a petrochemical company came to us, then, we would certainly think very carefully about what we would do and how we might support them. So, it's difficult, to have a clear set of values and ethos and morals and still aimed for commercial success. So, when I look back, I think, well, it was a great opportunity to talk about things that are important, to give me a platform to do that from. I don't think anybody else was really doing it at the time. And if it has inspired or paved a way for more of those sorts of programs or to enhance a sense of interest in some of those things, then great. It may not have had any influence whatsoever, but the fact that when I've spoken to people and they've mentioned it or remember me for doing certain things, then that's, that makes me feel that I had even just a little bit of impact.
Very good. Well, Oliver, our time is nearly up. Final question. The Roca Gallery show finishes on the 30th of September. So what's next for you after that?
Yeah, well, we are continuing to develop our design ethos around biophilic design and life-centered design. So that's really important to us. We are looking at ways of bringing those in for different organizations. So at the moment, we're working with the likes of John Lewis on their build-to-rent schemes and looking at how we can cross professional silos and integrate nature connections from landscape to architecture through into the interiors and the public amenities and the way that that's all operated. We're working with various hospitality groups as well, looking at the role that nature plays to soothe and restore people, but also more deeply connect them to the sense of place and space and the life in that place. And that's really interesting as well. So we seem to be getting approached by ever bigger organizations that recognize that nature has a role to play, that design isn't just about expressing identity and power and wealth and status, but that actually it can be used as a force for good to mitigate the impacts of climate change, to support biodiversity, and also to support greater levels of happiness and well-being throughout their built environment portfolio. And for me, that's a kind of really exciting area where we get this opportunity to take these ideas and explore them across different building sectors and for different clients.
Well, it sounds wonderful, Oliver. Very good luck with it all. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. I mean, you've given me some really juicy questions and dragged up the past like nobody else. Yeah.
I apologize for that. Profusely. But here's the thing. I think changing rooms is really important. People are very snotty about it, but I think changing rooms played a big role in British society at a given time.
It had its time and place. Looking back, it was a very creative time. And to be honest, I had a total blast doing it.
Well, I'm sure you did. Well, thank you so much. And I'll see you soon, hopefully.
It's been a pleasure, Grant. Thank you.
Biospaces, Regenerative Resilient Futures runs at the Roca Gallery until the 30th of September. You can find out more about Oliver at oliverheath.com. And remember, the Material Matters Fair runs from the 18th to the 21st of September at Barge House, Oxo Tower Wharf. Admission is free for trade, but you must register in advance. I'll put a link in the blurb that comes with this episode. As ever, to find other podcasts I've done and sign up to our newsletter, go to materialmatters.design. And there are images relating to the interviews on our Instagram page, which is also materialmatters.design. And it would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £2.50 a month, you can receive an invite to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message, the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience.